Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I'll be explaining an overview of the endocrine system and how to diagnose endocrine diseases. So let's get started. Number one, I want you to take a look at the difference between the nervous system, which allows actions to happen within minutes or even within seconds, and that requires neurons and neurotransmitters. On the other hand, the endocrine system, consisting of hormones going through blood secreted from different organs, would usually regulate stuff that need to be regulated within hours, right? Or even within days to weeks. And that's through molecules called hormones that travel into the blood to allow this control. Now, stuff like electrolytes, for example, blood pressure, blood glucose, reproduction, these are all controlled via hormones. So let's take a look at the major endocrine glands and how these are regulated. There's always a form of regulation to stop anything excessive in the body as part of homeostasis, and therefore something is called negative feedback you have to know about is almost applicable to all forms of hormones except only one called oxytocin that may undergo positive feedback, as in when more of it is released it allows more to be released. That's like a multiplication. However, usually with all forms of hormones there is regulation to prevent anything excessive, any excessive overtuning, and that is through negative feedback. That is, when there is more of the hormone, something happens to allow less of it to be secreted so that it goes back to the level that we want. All right, I'm going to explain this further. So let's take a look at the major endocrine glands in the human body. As you can see, we have end organs that are under control of the pituitary hormones. All right, so we have the hypothalamus, all right, which releases something called releasing hormones. These act on the pituitary gland, which releases its own hormones to affect different peripheral organs like the thyroid, the adrenal, and the reproductive organs, the gonads, whether testis in males or ovary in females. Alright guys, the pineal gland acts separately to release melatonin as part of the circadian rhythm to initiate sleep during the dark. Alright, now the pancreas has little to do with the pituitary regulation. It's tightly regulated by the blood glucose level. And so that's probably the only thing that's not under control of the pituitary. And so when blood glucose is high, it stimulates insulin secretion. When blood glucose is low, it stimulates glucagon secretion, and that's unrelated to the pituitary. All right. Now, the pituitary gland releases two hormones that are considered acting hormones rather than tropic hormones. There's something called releasing hormones, like I told you, from the hypothalamus. These end with the suffix RH, for example, GnRH, let's say TRH, right? These are releasing hormones because they stimulate the pituitary to release other hormones. And so they do not act directly at the end tissues, right? Now, the pituitary gland also produces similar hormones called tropic hormones, and these stimulate the end organs like the thyroid or the adrenals to secrete the final functioning hormones. So tropic hormone of the TRH is TSH. The tropic hormone of GnRH is FSH from the pituitary, LH from the pituitary. All right. However, the pituitary gland can produce two hormones that are considered directly acting on the end tissues. They're not stimulating any gland, they're stimulating the peripheral tissues, and that's two hormones called prolactin and growth hormone. Those act directly at the tissues, and those are produced from the same type of cell called the acidophil. So these you have to know about, because when there is a pituitary adenoma, the only two hormones that are directly in action as a result of that would be prolactin, causing the galactorrhea, gynecomastia in males, causing amenorrhea in females, and all these stuff. Plus, of course, bitemporal hemianopia and all the stuff you know about, and growth hormone as well. If the patient has acromegaly, they may still suffer symptoms of hyperprolactinemia because both are secreted from the same cell. That's something high yield you need to know about, because a tumor of the pituitary doesn't lead to increased release of TSH or FSH or LH. That's not really common. What's more common is if this is an acidophil adenoma that produces those end hormones, prolactin and growth hormone. And by the way, growth hormone, just like cortisol, is an anti-insulin hormone. There is all those hormones on one side and there's insulin on the other side. Insulin works to decrease blood glucose. Any other hormone I'm going to mention would act to increase blood glucose and is therefore called an anti-insulin hormone. And that includes everything else other than insulin. That's glucagon, number one. We have thyroxine. We have cortisol, catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. All of these work to increase blood glucose in the fight or flight mode and are therefore called anti-insulin. Now let's go back to the releasing entropic hormones. Now that the pituitary gland is stimulated by the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, it will start releasing the tropic hormones. So TSH is a tropic hormone for the thyroid gland, stimulating it to release its final end hormone that acts on the tissues, which is going to be thyroxine, T4, that's converted to the active form T3 at the tissues, and that works to increase metabolic rate and acts on the heart, increases its sensitivity to catecholamines, and so in the end this is supposed to increase the heart rate, metabolism, and so on, right? Now, how about the adrenal gland hormones? When the pituitary gland is stimulated by the hypothalamus, which releases the corticotropin releasing hormone CRH, this goes to the pituitary gland to stimulate the release of the tropic hormone ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This then goes to the adrenal gland and stimulates the release of two major hormones of the adrenal gland. We know that the adrenal gland has 3 layers. You can see here. One of them releases cortisol, and that's the most important, zona fasciculata. The other, zona reticularis, releases androgens called adrenal androgens, and those guys are under control of ACTH. Once ACTH is released, it will stimulate the release of those two hormones. Therefore, if we have a pituitary adenoma that's secreting a lot of ACTH, that will lead to increased cortisol as well as androgens. So don't be surprised when a patient comes in with Cushing's disease, right? Disease as in it's in the head from the pituitary, stimulated by ACTH. Don't be surprised that they're gonna still have some androgenic symptoms, like let's say a woman, she'd have hirsutism, yeah, and ovulatory dysfunction because of that. However, for the zona glomerulosa up there, that's really not under control of ACTH, This is the one that releases aldosterone, and that's really under control of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. That's really controlled by blood volume and potassium, sodium, and all these stuff. So as you can see here, we start by the hypothalamus that releases releasing hormones. It goes to the pituitary that releases tropic hormones in order to stimulate the final end organ, the adrenal cortex, to release cortisol and androgens. Now when there's a lot of it, normally it should inhibit any further release by negative feedback through inhibiting the pituitary and inhibiting the hypothalamus, and that should bring levels back to normal. However, if there is any abnormality of that, let's say the adrenal is hyperfunctioning, there's a tumor here that's releasing excessive cortisol, this will not be able to inhibit anything further because there's already a source here, or maybe there is a tumor of the pituitary here that's already releasing a lot of ACTH no matter how much there is negative feedback inhibition, and that's what leads to excessive levels of cortisol, and that's what leads to Cushing's, or maybe when there's an ectopic hormone or anything, as I mentioned in my other videos. All right, guys. Now let's go back to the pituitary, which would stimulate the reproductive organs now. So we have the hypothalamus that releases GnRH, that's the releasing hormone. GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. It will go to the pituitary and stimulate the release of the gonadotropins, FSH and LH. That's both in males or females. Those are called the gonadotropins. They will go to the testis in males to stimulate spermatogenesis and production of testosterone. FSH stimulates spermatogenesis, LH stimulates production of testosterone. That's in males. In females, FSH will stimulate ovulation. That's equivalent to spermatogenesis in males. And FSH will stimulate ovarian maturation and estrogen release, while LH surge mainly will stimulate ovulation, that's the release of the oocyte, and release of progesterone, mainly in the second part of the cycle. Okay, so that was an overview. As you can see here, that's the importance of these hormones, controlling electrolytes mainly through aldosterone and cortisol as well. If it's in excessive amounts, it will act like a mineralocorticoid. Blood sugar, that's insulin on one side, acts to reduce blood sugar, and on the other side we have all the other hormones I mentioned, guys: glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, thyroxine. That's on the other side. How about blood pressure? Mainly that's through aldosterone because it increases blood volume through salt and water retention. But at the same time, don't forget cortisol, don't forget thyroxine, because cortisol, guys, increases the action of catecholamines on the blood vessels, leading to vasoconstriction. So it acts to increase blood pressure as well. While thyroxine, being a vasodilator, acts to reduce diastolic blood pressure, being a vasodilator, but it will also increase systolic blood pressure on the other side, as it stimulates increased heart rate and contractility, right? So these hormones also work on blood pressure. Metabolism, that's mainly thyroxine, and reproduction, as I told you, the gonadotropins, and the final end hormones, estrogen and testosterone. All right, now how can I detect and diagnose endocrinological diseases? You gotta know there is some sort of a rule here. Okay, guys, for end hormones, let's say prolactin, let's say thyroxine, stuff like that, I can measure their levels in blood if I'm suspecting deficiency or excess. mainly would be in cases like prolactinoma. I'm going to measure the direct level because that's unlikely to be affected by circadian rhythm. This is a tumor. For thyrotoxicosis, I'm going to measure its direct level as well. Let's say someone has hypogonadism, a male, for example, I want to check their testosterone level, right? And let's say that someone has Addison's or adrenal insufficiency, I want to check their cortisol level, right? However, you gotta know that there is something called the circadian rhythm of these hormones. Like if you measure their direct level just at any time like that, you could be at the trough or at the peak of the secretion, so it may come out as a false result, false positive or false negative. For that reason, it's best to test the gland itself, the end gland. Let's say I'm suspecting adrenal insufficiency. So I want to see whether the problem is from the adrenal gland itself or from the pituitary or whatever. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to challenge it, right? So if I'm suspecting that it's not working, I'm gonna stimulate it. That's called the ACTH stimulation test, right? Let's say I'm suspecting the pituitary gland is not functioning, there's hypopituitarism. Why not stimulate it? How am I going to do that? In case, let's say I'm suspecting hypopituitarism in a patient with low growth hormone, infantilism or whatever it's called, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stimulate secretion of growth hormone. What stimulates secretion of growth hormone? Hypoglycemia. So let's give this patient insulin, growth hormone stimulation test, or a safer test would be alanine. Also, amino acids like alanine stimulate growth hormone. And so when you're suspecting underactivity, you're going to do a stimulation test, right? How about if I'm suspecting overactivity? You got it. You're going to do a suppression test, right? So let's say someone's having symptoms of Cushing, and I want to know whether this is from the pituitary. Is it going to be suppressed, or it's probably ectopic? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some high dose cortisol to stop what's going on and suppress the pituitary. If it were due to a lot of ACTH release from the pituitary, that should at least inhibit at high doses. It should exert the negative feedback and suppress what's going on. Rather, if it was a tumor that's releasing a lot of ACTH regardless, this cortisol wouldn't work by the negative feedback mechanism, so suppression wouldn't be really effective. And so you can see here that we were able to do dynamic tests for more accurate and more specific diagnosis of endocrinological diseases, right? While other disorders may allow for measuring the direct blood level without doing anything dynamic. What makes it dynamic is because it's under negative feedback, it's under control, and what makes it dynamic is also because there is a circadian rhythm where I can't just measure it at any time of the day, right? Now we can still do imaging tests for the structure. Let's say we have a thyroid disorder, we're going to do a thyroid ultrasound. We can still do functional studies, especially for the thyroid, will be scintigraphy with uptake of iodine, right? We have thyroid antibodies. If I want to check blood sugar control long term, I'm going to do HbA1c. So you can see here there's other more specific tests, but the rule here is that because these have a circadian rhythm, you can't just do a direct measurement at any time of the day. It's best to either have a total level over the entire day, like cortisol in urine 24 hours, or better, a dynamic test. Yeah, and that must precede any sort of imaging, right? Endocrinological disorders are first diagnosed biochemically, guys, before imaging. Let's say if you have a prolactinoma, I'm going to measure the serum prolactin first before I do an MRI of the pituitary. That's very high yield to know. I'm going to do a dexamethasone suppression test before any imaging of the adrenal or the pituitary, because it's likely that you may find something incidental on imaging that may be unrelated to what this patient is going through. All right, guys, I hope this video helped. Let me know what you think.